I have spent more than 3 decades walking through the darkest corners of New York, but there are cases that never quite settle into the past. They remain suspended in the air like dust in an empty room, refusing to be forgotten. One of those cases is the one I am opening for you today. My name is Miller Files, detective and investigator, and this is the story of the Gray Man, the case that taught me that monsters do not always hide in abandoned alleys. Sometimes they stand right in front of you, wearing a quiet smile and the clothes of an old, harmless man. To understand the origins of this case, you need to understand the city first. New York in the 1920s was a place of ambition and desperation stitched together in the shape of skyscrapers. Thousands came looking for work. Hundreds arrived every day chasing promises they barely understood, and beneath that thick layer of movement and noise, there was a darker current running through the streets. Children disappeared more easily than people believed. Families moved often. Policing across boroughs was fragmented. A missing child could vanish within days into the machinery of poverty, relocation, and the overwhelming chaos of the city. When I close my eyes and picture New York back then, I don't see the shimmering lights or the modern skyline. I see crowded tenements, windows leaking yellow light into alleyways that always seemed too narrow, and the feeling that something could be watching you from just around the corner. It was a city built on dreams, yes, but also on shadows. In 1924, one of those shadows momentarily took shape. The case concerned a boy named Francis McDonald, a gentle child whose life was quietly intertwined with the rhythms of his family and neighborhood. On a warm afternoon, he vanished. The search brought neighbors, police officers, and volunteers across Staten Island, combing forests and abandoned properties. The city was smaller then, but also more fragmented. Information traveled slowly. Fear traveled faster. Witnesses reported seeing a strange figure near the boy. The description was odd. Not a brute. Not a stranger with violent mannerisms. Instead, they recalled an old man, thin, pale, with a shock of gray hair and a demeanor that seemed neither threatening nor memorable. That was the detail that troubled me later. He did not stand out. He blended in as if he was made from the same dust that drifted through the old streets. The newspapers called him a mysterious visitor, but a name began circulating quietly among investigators. The Gray Man? This was not yet my case. I was too young, too new to the department. But when I eventually read the file years later, the descriptions chilled me more than any traditional portrait of a criminal ever could. An old man following a child, moving slowly, calmly, without raising alarm, not lurking, not sprinting, just present like a quiet breath of wind before a storm. The case of Francis McDonald dissolved over time. There was no suspect, no confession, no substantial lead. The papers moved on. The city moved on. But not everyone forgot. Sometimes a detail survives in a file only because a detective long gone scribbled under a page with a trembling hand. I remember the note in the margin, "Gray Man seen walking into woods." Something so small, something that should have mattered more. 2 years passed, and new tragedies surfaced. Crime never took a holiday, not in New York. Yet, beneath all the noise, there was a pattern forming, one that few detectives could see because it wasn't bold or flamboyant. It was subtle, almost respectful in its quietness. The city was filled with loud criminals, men who shouted their violence and showed their greed openly. But there are rarer predators, the kind who choose silence as their weapon. That was the category Albert Fish eventually fit into. When the name first crossed my desk much later, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine without knowing why. Names do that to you sometimes. They carry weight, even before the story behind them unfolds. At that point, all we had was a series of scattered accounts, sightings of an old man near playgrounds, children speaking of a strange grandpa watching them, families mentioning a visitor who offered advice or asked for directions. None of it amounted to a crime. None of it raised alarms. The city is filled with older men wandering from place to place. Loneliness is not a crime. Fragility is not suspicious. But intent always hides in the details, and the details were beginning to sharpen. Before Fish was identified formally, he lived a transient life. He moved from boarding house to boarding house, never staying long enough for anyone to become curious. He blended into the background of the working class, laborers, janitors, handymen, and factory men. He was polite in a forgettable way. He looked like someone time itself had worn down, and yet, beneath that frail exterior, something darker stirred. Years later, when I pieced together his movements, I realized he had been studying families long before he ever approached them. He watched without looking suspicious. He listened without speaking. He walked neighborhoods until he understood which families were struggling, which parents were overwhelmed, which children were left to roam unsupervised. To the untrained eye, he looked harmless. But in the realm of predators, harmlessness is often the deadliest disguise. People imagine evil as something loud, grotesque, or dramatic. The truth is quieter. Evil whispers. Evil waits. Evil chooses the moment when everyone else has looked away. By 1928, the whispers had turned into the faint outline of a hunter. But no one yet understood what kind of man they were dealing with. No one understood what he was capable of. No one realized that a single visit to a small apartment in Harlem would become the turning point that defined him as one of the most disturbing criminals in American history. That visit belonged to the Budd family. The Budds were a working-class family trying to survive in a city that did not make survival easy. They lived simply, cared deeply for one another, and believed in the small kindnesses strangers sometimes offered. On the morning of May 25th, 1928, they received such a visitor, the old man, the quiet one, the one with the soft voice and gentle eyes. He introduced himself not as Albert Fish, but as a farmer named Frank Howard, a friendly employer seeking strong young men to help with his farm, a man offering opportunity, wages, dignity, and the chance at a better life for two teenage boys eager to work. From the moment he stepped inside their home, everything changed. Such moments are only visible in retrospect. At the time, the Budds saw kindness. The city saw nothing, but a predator saw an opening. His calm demeanor, his polite gestures, and the trembling kindness in his voice created trust. The kind of trust only a skilled manipulator can summon. He earned the confidence of the Budd parents quickly. He created a story so ordinary that it was difficult to doubt: a farm, a job, a promise of honest labor. Nothing sounded malicious. The Budds offered him a seat, and what followed would become the beginning of a nightmare. Fish spoke of his farm, the work available, the wages he could offer, and the need for reliable helpers. He mentioned a family gathering that afternoon, a birthday party for his niece in Westchester. A harmless detail, a casual thread. But that thread would lead Grace Budd out of her home and into a fate no one could have imagined. Grace was young, bright, curious, and hopeful. When Fish suggested she join him for the celebration, it seemed innocent enough. Parents in that era believed in politeness, hospitality, and the decency of the elderly. The idea that an old man could pose a danger to a child felt remote and unreasonable. Looking back, I do not blame them. Trust is a natural instinct. Suspicion is learned through pain, and the Budd family had no reason to suspect that the man sipping tea quietly in their home was studying them meticulously, deciding how to separate them from their daughter. That afternoon, Grace left with him. It was the last time her family saw her alive. The city searched. The newspapers demanded answers. But the elderly man had vanished back into the folds of New York's endless neighborhoods, and the case drifted slowly into the cold. This is where Episode 1 closes on the moment hope begins to fracture and darkness begins to take shape. The gray man had stepped from rumor into reality, and though the city did not yet know his name, the hunt for him had already begun. In the following episode, I will walk you through how the police built a timeline, how 6 long years passed without a single break in the case, and how one letter addressed to the Budd home finally shattered Albert Fish's cloak of invisibility forever. The disappearance of Grace Budd struck New York like a sudden winter storm, a cold front no one saw coming, yet everyone immediately felt. In the earliest days of the investigation, detectives rushed through the streets, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and searching alleys and train stations. Hope was still alive then, fragile and trembling, but alive. When a child goes missing, the first 48 hours decide everything. After that, hope becomes a candle fighting against a gathering wind. And in the case of Grace Budd, that wind became a relentless storm lasting 6 years. I was not yet assigned to the Budd case in the beginning, but I learned every detail the moment the file fell into my hands years later. The early investigation revealed a city scrambling to understand what had happened. Detectives believed the man calling himself Frank Howard truly lived on a farm somewhere north of the city. Officers were dispatched to scour Westchester, scanning miles of farmland, speaking with every possible farmer in the region. Not one of them recognized the description of the frail old man with soft eyes and a slow voice. It was as if the stranger had stepped out of thin air and vanished back into it. Detectives interviewed dozens of families who had posted job listings or advertised labor opportunities. None had spoken with a man by that name. No one could confirm a niece's birthday party. The man's story, which felt so ordinary and harmless in the Budd family's living room, unraveled into a thread of nothing. Even the handwriting analysis of his note was inconclusive. The paper he used was common. The ink was common. The mannerisms he adopted were common. It was not incompetence that stalled the investigation, but the simple truth that they were looking for a man who had built an entire life around being invisible. When I later reviewed those early documents, I recognized the subtle brilliance in Fish's strategies. His disguise was not a costume. It was age itself. People underestimated him because he looked like someone time had already defeated. But men like him understand the advantage of appearing weak. The world lets weak men pass. It opens doors for them. It trusts them with children. That was his camouflage, not darkness, not brutality, fragility. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the Budd case slipped into silence. The newspapers stopped printing updates. Reporters found new tragedies to spotlight. Public attention drifted away. Cold cases do not die, but they sleep. They rest in metal file cabinets, waiting for a moment when someone curious or determined enough decides to open them again. During those early years, Fish lived quietly in New York, moving from one boarding house to another. He paid rent in coins or small bills. He carried little more than a small bundle of clothes, a pocket knife, and the few personal items that fit into a weathered bag. He worked odd jobs as a painter, a handyman, or a messenger. He carved out a life that blended into the background of poverty where no one bothers to ask questions. The anonymity of the poor protected him more than any clever escape route could. A man who leaves no footprint cannot be followed, but the investigation did not disappear entirely. A few detectives, stubborn and haunted, held onto the case. They interviewed the Budd family again and again, hoping memory might reveal a detail they had missed. Even the smallest misremembered word can sometimes unlock a new path. But the Budds could only repeat what they already told: a gentle man, an employer, a grandfatherly figure whose calm voice gave them no reason to fear him. The Budd parents aged quickly in those 6 years. Losing a child does that. It rewires the brain and drains the soul. When I met them later, long after the arrest, I could still see that weight in their eyes. The father once told me that every night he replayed the moment he agreed to let Grace leave. Every night he wondered whether he should have noticed something, anything, that would have warned him. But how does a man notice evil when it smiles with the softness of a feather and speaks with the politeness of a priest? While the Budds grieved, Albert Fish watched other neighborhoods. He spent time in Brooklyn, in Harlem, in the Bronx, always wandering, always observing. Children then played outside in the streets far more freely than they do now. Parents believed the world was hard, but not monstrous. That illusion created openings. Fish studied these openings, the way a scholar studies old manuscripts. He waited for the right moment. He built patience into an art form. It was during these 6 years that Fish's psychological profile took shape, at least in my understanding. He possessed an unusual mixture of qualities that made him uniquely dangerous. He was calculating, but not impulsive. He was patient, but not passive. He understood the rhythms of the city and how to hide within them. Above all, he recognized that the world rarely questions the intentions of old men. Age was his invisibility cloak, not a burden. He carried a philosophy as twisted as his crimes. He believed God spoke to him. He believed suffering was a message. He believed children were symbols of purity that he was destined to corrupt. When I later questioned him, he spoke with a serene calmness that would unsettle the strongest detective. His voice never rose. His hands never shook. He described his actions as if they were sacred rituals rather than crimes. But during the 6-year void, the police had no idea who he was. They did not know his name, his habits, or his psychological patterns. All they had was a ghost, a rumor, a thin description of a frail man who could easily be confused with hundreds of others. The subtlety of his disguise ensured that the investigation stagnated. At one point, the police investigated a butcher who lived near Harlem after several children claimed he frightened them. For weeks, detectives tailed him, questioned his customers, and inspected his shop. He turned out to be harmless, a man whose stern expression disguised a gentle personality. Cases like these drain manpower and morale. Every false lead pushed them further from the truth. The city also changed during the 6 years of darkness. New York grew louder, tougher, more industrialized. The shadows grew with it. The Great Depression tightened its grip, plunging families into hunger and desperation. Poverty expanded, and with it, the vulnerability of children. Fish exploited these conditions effortlessly. A hungry child is more trusting. A tired parent is more distracted. A struggling neighborhood is less likely to scrutinize an old man offering small kindnesses. One of the most chilling elements of Fish's behavior during this period is how methodically he selected his surroundings. He sought out neighborhoods where people were transient, communities where individuals came and went without leaving much trace. In such places, a stranger was just another face. People moved constantly in search of cheaper rent. Entire blocks changed tenants in a matter of months. A predator could vanish simply by crossing the street. When I reconstructed Fish's timeline years later, I realized there were days, weeks, even months where no one could confirm his whereabouts. He drifted through the cracks of New York like smoke, and yet his quietness was not the quietness of peace. It was the quietness of a predator lying low after striking, waiting for the world to stop looking in his direction. But the Bud case did not die. It remained in the back of every detective's mind, a haunting reminder of a child taken by a ghost. The file was marked cold, but cold files have a way of warming again when touched by tragedy or curiosity. Younger detectives inherited older detectives' burdens. Rumors about the gray man circulated quietly through precincts, especially among those who believed that evil does not forget its habits, but only pauses. Through those years, something darker was happening inside Fish. His delusions were growing stronger. His belief that he was chosen, guided, or commanded intensified, and yet he maintained the discipline to hide these beliefs from strangers. Only when he was finally captured did he reveal the depth of his psychological decay. But during the 6-year void, his restraint kept him safe from suspicion. One of the tragedies of that era was the lack of a centralized criminal database. If a man committed a crime in one borough, detectives in another borough might never hear of it. Records were inconsistent. Fingerprint sharing was limited. Communication between departments required letters or in-person meetings. Fish understood this fragmentation instinctively. He moved just enough to avoid becoming familiar, but never far enough to sever his connection to the city he hunted in. Meanwhile, the Bud family suffered in silence. The parents aged years beyond their time. The brothers struggled with guilt, believing they should have noticed something, though no reasonable person could have. Their home became a shrine to a daughter whose laughter no longer echoed through the halls. The city forgot them, but they never forgot her. The police, despite their best efforts, could not manufacture leads from nothing. With no ransom note, no recordings, no sightings, and no body, the Bud case drifted deeper into darkness. New detectives arrived, reviewed the file, theorized endlessly, and eventually concluded that without new evidence, the case was unworkable. They were right, but they were also wrong, because sometimes a monster makes a mistake. Sometimes the quietest man cannot resist leaving a mark, and Albert Fish was a man who wanted to be remembered, even if he did not admit it. The seeds of his arrogance and his warped sense of legacy were growing. Eventually, these seeds would bloom in the form of a letter that shattered 6 years of silence and exposed the predator who had hidden in plain sight. But before that moment, the city lived inside the void, unaware that the man responsible for Grace Bud's disappearance still walked among them, breathing the same air, riding the same trains, passing families on the same sidewalks. In the next episode, we will explore that crucial turning point, the fragile line between silence and revelation, the letter, the mistake, the unraveling of a predator's anonymity. But for now, Episode 2 ends in the long shadow of 6 years of uncertainty and the chilling understanding that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who learn to disappear while standing in the middle of a crowded street. There are moments in an investigation that arrive without warning, moments when the silence of years cracks open like a sheet of ice under a sudden weight. For the Bud case, that moment came on a gray November morning in 1934. The Bud family, who had spent 6 years living in the shadow of uncertainty, opened their mailbox to find an envelope with no return address. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a simple piece of mail among the bills and notices. But inside that envelope lay the key to the darkest chapter of their lives and the beginning of the end for the man who had stolen their daughter. The letter arrived quietly, as if the city itself had decided to whisper a truth it had held too long. Mrs. Budd opened it slowly, not expecting revelation or closure. What she found instead was a message that would ignite the entire investigation again. The letter was written in uneven strokes, as though the writer's hand trembled with age or excitement or madness. It began innocently enough, almost like a confession shaped into a narrative. But as she read deeper, the words shifted from story to horror, from explanation to something that could only be described as a deliberate unveiling of monstrosity. I will not repeat the contents of that letter. Some truths are too cruel to be spoken aloud. Out of respect for Grace Budd and her family, and for the dignity of victims everywhere, I will not give voice to the details Fish chose to put into ink. But what matters for the investigation is this. The letter was not simply a confession. It was a victory lap, a declaration, a message sent from a man who believed himself untouchable, a man who wanted the family to know what he had done, a man who desired to be remembered. That desire, twisted and malignant, became his downfall. When the Budd family delivered the letter to the police, the station shifted from routine calm to electric urgency. Every detective felt something stir within them. Cases this cold rarely erupt back to life. The air in the precinct changed. Hope, fear, determination, and horror tangled in one space. And in the middle of it stood the letter, silent but screaming for justice. When I first read that letter, years after the family had received it, I was struck not by the brutality of the words, but by the arrogance embedded in them. Fish wrote with the certainty of someone who believed himself invisible. He had spent 6 years watching the world forget him, and in his isolation, he convinced himself that he was beyond the reach of consequence. Criminals often fall because they underestimate the persistence of memory. The gray man was no different. The first step in deciphering the letter was to study the physical details. The paper was inexpensive and widespread. It carried no watermark, no brand marker, no unique thread pattern. The envelope was similarly plain, the type favored by thousands across the city. Fish had made nearly no mistakes in the materials he used. But criminals often slip not in their choices, but in their habits. The one meaningful clue lay in the envelope's printed emblem, a small reference to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. At first glance, it appeared like a simple, reused envelope, something an elderly man might pick up from a charity box or find lying around a boarding house. But to an investigator, every reused object leaves a faint trail. I remember holding that envelope the first time and imagining all the hands it had passed through, the rooms it had rested in, the conversations that had happened near it. Somewhere along that chain was the man we had been trying to find for 6 years. We traced the envelope back to a batch given out to chauffeurs as part of their union correspondence. The association confirmed that old envelopes were sometimes discarded in bulk to boarding houses when new stationery arrived. That detail opened a small but crucial path. If the envelope had been repurposed, then the writer likely lived in or frequented one of the boarding houses known to receive these old supplies. That was when the investigation turned from cold to burning. We sent officers across Manhattan and the Bronx to visit dozens of boarding houses. The task was grueling. These establishments were transient by nature. People came and went daily. Landlords forgot names, lost records, or simply lied to avoid trouble. But persistence is the spine of any investigation, and slowly patterns began to emerge. Certain houses consistently received leftover envelopes from the Chauffeurs Association. Most of their tenants were older men, laborers, drifters, widowers, veterans, and forgotten souls trying to survive the Depression, and somewhere among them hid a predator. By the time I personally joined the renewed investigation, the city's mood had shifted. Detectives who had once dismissed the Budd case as unsolvable now approached it with renewed focus. Even the press sensed movement. Rumors drifted through newsrooms. Something was happening in the shadows of the Budd investigation. Something important. But the breakthrough came not from speculation, nor from luck, but from the quiet testimony of a boarding house keeper on East 52nd Street. She remembered an elderly man who fit the description given years earlier. Skinny, gray hair, pale eyes, a gentle voice, a polite demeanor. He had stayed in one of her rooms months earlier. He often returned to check whether any mail had arrived for him. When the keeper said that last sentence, I felt my pulse quicken. It aligned too perfectly with the personality sketched in the letter. A man who wanted to be remembered would check for responses. A man who believed himself unseen would not fear returning to a place connected to his messages. This was the first real pulse of life the case had shown in years. The woman provided a name he had once given her, Albert H. Fish. The sound of that name settled into the room like dust, disturbed by a sudden gust of wind. It had weight. It felt wrong, but in the way that truth often reveals itself strange at first and then undeniable. He had left the boarding house months earlier, but she believed he would return. Again, something in his manner suggested he had nowhere else to anchor himself. Drifters tend to circle familiarity. It gives them the illusion of permanence. We set up surveillance. Days passed. The cold wind of November scraped against the windows. Every time the door opened, we looked up. Every time a man passed by on the street, we leaned forward. The city moved around us while we waited for the man who had refused to be seen. Then, on a quiet afternoon, he appeared. He approached with a slow, measured gait, as if walking was an act of intention rather than habit. His shoulders stooped in an almost delicate posture. His gray hair peeked from under a worn hat. His clothing hung loosely from his thin frame. He looked older than the years recorded in any census ledger. He looked like a man built from mist. But I knew. The moment I saw him, I felt something inside me tighten. Darkness has a scent, a weight, a presence, and it hung around him like an unspoken confession. We stepped out to meet him. He did not run. He did not resist. He did not even flinch. He looked at me as though he had been expecting this moment, as though capture was not an end, but a continuation of whatever story he had written for himself. I asked, "Are you Mr. Howard?" He shook his head slowly. No smile, no surprise, only acceptance. "My name is Albert Fish. There are confessions shouted in fear. There are confessions dragged out by force. And then there are confessions given with calm certainty, as though the speaker believes he is offering a gift rather than a truth." Fish belonged to the last category. We brought him in for questioning. The walk to the station felt surreal. People passed by us unaware that the man beside me was the monster who had haunted the city's shadows for a decade. He looked like a grandfather, fragile and inconsequential. Yet beneath that veil was a depth of violence that defied comprehension. During interrogation, he spoke freely, not fully, not proudly, but with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. He acknowledged writing the letter. He described his movements over the years. He denied nothing. He justified everything. Listening to him was like listening to madness wrap itself in the language of faith. He said he believed he was chosen. He said God had given him signs. He said Grace Budd had been his calling. As I sat across from him, I realized that evil does not always arrive in fury. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper. Sometimes it is thin and quiet. Sometimes it wears a face softened by age. The letter had broken the silence. But what followed was the shattering of illusions. The city would soon learn the truth about the man known as the Gray Man. But in that small room, long before the public understood, I saw him for what he truly was. Not a ghost, not a rumor, but a human being who had chosen darkness with deliberate devotion. The arrest was just the beginning. The trial, the testimonies, the revelations would come later. But episode 3 ends with the moment the hunter finally stepped into the light, not because he was chased there, but because he could no longer resist the urge to be seen. The letter he intended as a victory became instead the instrument of his downfall. And in that paradox lies one of the greatest truths of criminology. The ego of a predator is often louder than the silence he hides behind. Bringing Albert Fish into the interrogation room did not feel like capturing a predator. It felt like escorting an old man across a busy street. That was the unsettling part. Everyone expects evil to look like a monster, but sometimes it looks like a frail grandfather with trembling hands and apologetic eyes. As he sat across from me, his posture slightly bent, his fingers resting gently on the wooden table, he appeared at first glance to be a man defeated by life long before justice ever reached him. But the longer I looked at him, the more I sensed a stillness that was not weakness but calculation, a quiet that did not come from age, but from the confidence of a man who believed he had already made peace with his destiny. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the radiator as it struggled to fight the November cold. Fish stared at the table, not out of fear but contemplation, as if arranging his thoughts like puzzle pieces only he understood. When I asked him whether he understood why he had been brought in, he nodded slowly, not with reluctance, but almost with a strange serenity, as if surrendering to something he had expected for years. He said he knew the letter would eventually bring someone to him. He said he had felt the urge to write it for a long time. He spoke as though the letter had been a separate entity, a creature within him demanding to be released. Listening to him felt like listening to a man describe a haunting only he could see. His voice remained soft, almost tender, as though he were narrating someone else's sins rather than his own. I asked him about the name Frank Howard. He smiled faintly, a fragile and distant expression, and explained that the name came to him simply because it sounded trustworthy. He said, trust was the easiest currency to earn when you looked like him, a small old man with nothing to offer but a gentle demeanor. He admitted that his entire life had been built around the art of making people underestimate him. The weak are rarely feared, he said, and the fearless make easy prey. It took time to peel back the layers of this man. He did not resist questions. He did not deny his actions. But he explained them with a calmness that felt more disturbing than denial would have. There was no rage, no guilt, no anger, just conviction. He spoke of God often. Not the God most people understand, but a version he had constructed from fragments of scripture and hallucination. He believed he was guided. He believed he was chosen. And in that belief, he found justification for everything he had done. The more he spoke, the more the room felt smaller, colder, as if his presence drained the warmth from the air. There was nothing theatrical about him. He did not boast. He did not dramatize. He simply recounted, and that, in many ways, was the most chilling element. To him, these were not crimes. They were steps on a path he believed had been carved for him long before he was born. As detectives, we needed facts, timelines, evidence, the concrete foundation on which justice could be built. But what Fish offered was something different, a narrative shaped by delusion. Separating truth from the mythology he constructed around himself required patience and caution. He was not lying, but he was not grounded in reality either. He existed in the space between truth and madness, and navigating that space felt like walking across a frozen lake unsure where the ice might crack. We revisited the day Grace Budd disappeared. Fish described arriving at the Budd home with a level of detail that made my stomach turn. Not because of what he described, but because of how he described it. He recalled the wallpaper, the placement of the furniture, the tone of Mrs. Budd's voice. He remembered the temperature of the room and the way sunlight filtered through the window. He spoke of these things with fondness, almost tenderness. To him, the Budd home had been a place of warmth, a stage on which he performed the role of the harmless old man. When asked why he chose Grace, he paused. It was the first moment in the interrogation when he hesitated. He closed his eyes as if searching for an answer inside himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was nearly a whisper. He said she was bright. He said she trusted him. He said she smiled at him. He said that smile stayed with him, and he interpreted it not as innocence, but as invitation. That distortion, that twisting of something pure into something monstrous, revealed the depth of his psychological collapse. Throughout the interrogation, doctors observed from behind the mirrored glass. They studied his gestures, his language patterns, the fluidity of his thoughts. Some believed he was insane. Others believed he was perfectly aware of his actions and used madness as a shield. The debate about his sanity would become central in the months that followed. But in that room, to me, insanity and intention existed side by side. He was a man capable of rational planning and irrational belief, a combination that made him both dangerous and unpredictable. The more he spoke, the more we came to understand the structure of his mind. He lived in a fragmented reality, a place where religious symbolism fused with violent impulses. But beneath that spiritual delusion lay meticulous intelligence. He knew how to manipulate trust. He knew how to hide in plain sight. He knew how to study the rhythms of neighborhoods, families, and children. His madness did not make him sloppy. It made him patient. When he finished speaking about Grace, he did something unexpected. He folded his hands and looked at me, not with fear or guilt, but with a question. He asked whether I believed God had a plan for every man. The sincerity in his voice was jarring. It felt like a conversation between two people standing at opposite ends of a moral universe. I did not answer him. Some questions do not deserve answers. As word of Fish's arrest spread, New York reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. Newspapers printed his face on their front pages, though many had difficulty believing that the timid old man in the photographs was capable of the crimes attributed to him. Some doubted the police. Others doubted the possibility of such evil existing in someone who looked like a frail pensioner. Crowds gathered outside the station, hoping to catch a glimpse of him to reconcile the human figure with the monstrous reputation. Within the precinct, detectives worked relentlessly to reconstruct the timeline of his movements, to match his statements with evidence, to confirm the details he provided. His confession opened doors, but confessions must be verified. The process was painstaking. Records from boarding houses had to be retrieved. Witnesses had to be re-interviewed. The path of a drifter is never straight. It loops and twists and disappears, and mapping it requires patience and precision. As we piece together the puzzle, a portrait emerged not of a supernatural monster, but of a deeply broken man who learned to weaponize his brokenness. He hid behind the illusion of fragility. He exploited the kindness of strangers. He blended into a society that often overlooks the elderly, the poor, the soft-spoken. He understood his invisibility better than any detective understood his presence. Sitting across from him in that interrogation room, I realized something unsettling. Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it speaks with a whisper. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it asks gentle questions. Sometimes it wears a face that does not match the weight of its actions. Fish existed in the quiet spaces of society, the cracks where empathy turns to assumption and assumption turns to blindness. He thrived there. He built a life there, and for years he escaped justice because no one imagined a man like him could exist. But in that small, cold room, under dim lights and guarded by silence, he no longer had shadows to retreat into. Every word he spoke brought him closer to the truth he claimed to embrace. Every confession stripped away another layer of the mask he had worn for decades. The interrogation lasted hours, then days. His story unfolded like a tangled map. But eventually, the truth stood clear enough to proceed. The psychological reports, the timeline, the letter, the testimonies, the details he volunteered, all converged into a portrait of a man who had crossed the boundaries of humanity long ago. We prepared for trial. The city braced itself. The newspapers sharpened their headlines. And the Budd family, who had lived for years without closure, finally saw a faint light at the end of the tunnel. Not justice yet, not healing, but movement. And in cases like this, movement is the first sign of hope. Episode 4 ends in the stillness before the storm. The confession is complete. The city knows the name of the gray man, and the courtroom waits, where the question of sanity, guilt, intention, and justice will collide in a battle that will determine not only Fish's fate, but the legacy of one of the darkest cases in New York's history. The final chapter of the Gray Man case began not in the interrogation room, nor in the offices where my colleagues and I had spent countless nights sorting through fragments of testimony and loose ends of a life lived in shadows. It began in a courtroom in White Plains, a place where sunlight filtered through tall windows and fell upon wooden benches worn smooth by years of waiting. The room held an air of solemnity, the kind that only accompanies trials that challenge not just the law, but the very boundaries of humanity. Albert Fish entered the courtroom as quietly as he had entered every other place. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost careful. He looked like a breeze could knock him over, and yet all eyes followed him. Some stared with revulsion, some with disbelief, some with a curiosity that bordered on horror. He sat gently in his chair, folding his hands as though preparing for a Sunday sermon, rather than a trial that would determine whether he lived or died. The prosecution began with clarity and confidence, presenting the long chain of evidence that had finally pulled Fish from the depths of obscurity. They spoke of the letter, of the timeline reconstructed through witness statements and boarding house registry books. They detailed how he had built trust, how he had entered the Budd home, how he had led Grace away. They did not need theatrics. The facts themselves carried a weight too heavy for embellishment. But it was the defense that introduced the deepest conflict of the trial. They claimed he was insane, not in the casual sense the public uses, but legally, profoundly, incurably. They described a man haunted by visions, driven by delusions, tormented by a mind fractured long before he ever stepped into the Budd home. They presented his childhood in an orphanage known for its cruelty. They recounted a life marked by trauma, poverty, abandonment, and an escalating spiral of mental deterioration. Experts testified in careful tones. Some painted him as a man whose entire sense of reality had been warped beyond repair. Others argued he was fully aware of his actions, that his meticulous planning contradicted the very essence of madness. The courtroom spent days balancing these two visions of one man. Was he a monster by choice or by fate? Could he distinguish right from wrong, or had he become lost in a labyrinth of his own creation? As I listened, I realized the question of sanity often distracts from something far simpler. Madness does not erase responsibility. Delusion does not dissolve intention. A man can be broken and still be dangerous. A man can lose his grip on reality and still choose to harm others with purpose. The law asks whether he understood the nature and consequences of his act. Fish understood. His own words during the interrogation made that clear. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution introduced excerpts from his letters, carefully selected to avoid unnecessary cruelty, while illustrating the clarity of his thought. You could hear the room shift. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters stopped their scribbling. The quiet horror in those written lines revealed not a man unaware of his actions, but a man who had shaped an entire philosophy around them. At one moment, a psychiatrist on the stand was asked whether Fish's beliefs excused him from responsibility. The doctor paused before answering. He said that some individuals construct worlds within their minds to justify what they wish to do. But the building of that world does not absolve them. It reveals the danger they pose. That answer stayed with me long after the trial ended. Throughout it all, Fish sat still, listening with the same gentle expression he had worn during the interrogation. He did not rage. He did not deny. He did not plead. He seemed almost disconnected from the gravity of the proceedings, as though watching someone else's trial play out before him. Occasionally he tilted his head slightly, as if curious, but never remorseful, never fearful. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate, the room emptied slowly. The tension had grown so thick that even breathing felt heavier. I stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold air settle into my lungs. I thought of the Budd family, of 6 years of unanswered questions, of a girl whose life ended before it began. Justice, in such cases, never restores balance. It only acknowledges loss. The jury returned sooner than expected. Their decision was unanimous. Albert Fish was guilty and legally responsible for his actions. The defense's plea of insanity had not persuaded them. The judge, maintaining solemn dignity, pronounced the sentence, death by electrocution, a sentence reserved for those the law deems fully accountable for crimes so severe that no other punishment could suffice. Fish accepted the verdict with the same quiet demeanor he had shown in every moment of the investigation. He nodded slightly, as though someone had just confirmed something he already knew. In the months that followed, while he awaited execution at Sing Sing prison, he granted several interviews. Journalists described him as polite, almost kindly. He asked for little. He spoke calmly of his past, offering details with a detachment that chilled even the most seasoned reporters. He prayed. He ate modestly. He slept soundly, as if unburdened by the weight of what he had done. I visited him once before the execution, not out of vengeance, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to understand the man whose shadow had stretched across so many lives. We sat across from each other in a small room divided by iron bars. He recognized me immediately and smiled faintly, the same fragile smile he had given during the interrogation. He asked whether I believed he would be forgiven. I told him forgiveness was not mine to give. He seemed to accept that, his eyes drifting off into some private corner of his thoughts. I studied him in that moment, wondering how a man so physically small could have carried such darkness. There was no revelation that day, no confession beyond what he had already said, no remorse, no epiphany, just a man waiting for an ending he believed had been written for him long ago. On January 16th, 1936, Albert Fish walked into the death chamber at Sing Sing. Witnesses later said he remained calm, almost peaceful. He sat in the electric chair with the resignation of someone taking a final rest. When asked for last words, he spoke so softly that few could hear him. The switch was pulled, and in a sudden flash of light and hum of current, the life of the gray man ended. But cases like this never end with the death of a perpetrator. They linger, they echo. They become cautionary tales, whispered across generations. In the aftermath of the execution, New York found itself grappling, not with the man Fish had been, but with what his existence revealed about the world. Evil does not always come roaring. Sometimes it walks slowly, politely, wearing the face of an old man who seems incapable of harm. Sometimes it hides in empty hallways and crowded streets, waiting for the moment when no one is looking. I returned to the Budd home sometime after the execution. The family answered the door with the same quiet dignity they had carried throughout the investigation. Their grief had not faded. Grief, like theirs, does not fade. But there was something else in the air now. Closure. Not peace, not healing. But closure, a door that had remained open for too long, had finally been allowed to shut. As I left their home, I found myself reflecting on the nature of darkness. It is not always loud. It is not always violent. It can be patient. It can be gentle. It can whisper instead of shout. And that is what makes it so dangerous. When I finally closed the case file, placing it among the others in the metal cabinet, I felt something shift within me, a sense that even the smallest, quietest individuals can harbor storms unimaginable. The gray man taught me that evil is not defined by appearance. It is defined by intention, by the choices one makes when no one is watching. This is the end of the gray man's story, but it is not the end of the lessons he leaves behind. As investigators, as human beings, we must never forget that darkness can live in the most unassuming places, and sometimes it waits behind a gentle smile. My name is Miller Files, and this concludes the case that has followed me like a shadow, the case that proved that the most ordinary face can hide the most extraordinary darkness.